We finished the root cellar about 3 years ago now, and it's actually worked really great for us. But I wanted to show you how we did the roof because that was probably the trickiest part. The hardest portion of it, of course, was building the form before you pour the concrete on. So go ahead and take a look at how we did that. We started out by cutting our 1/2-inch plywood into 8-foot long, 11.5-inch strips. We did them this size so that we could fit 4 onto each plywood sheet, and it ended up having a nice arch to it at this size. We then marked the center and cut a 3.5-inch deep, 1.5-inch wide notch out of the top for the backbone. We then used a section of wire fencing to make our line for the arch. We placed it 1 inch up from the base at each end and then had it arch up to the top of the board, and I drew in the line. We then used a jigsaw to cut out the arch. After we created the first one, we used it as a template for the other 8 so that they would all match. We then used a dado blade to cut a 3/4 of an inch notch in 9 straight 10-foot 2x4s. The arched plywood fit nicely into these grooves. All of the boards needed to be marked and cut for their specific location in the cellar as there was slight variation in the walls, and we wanted it to be a really snug fit. We also needed to measure and cut 2 straight 16-foot 2x4s for the length on the sides specific for each of these. These runners were what we ended up placing our arches on. We also measured each vertical post location to position the edge of the arch at the edge of the wall. We then cut them all to fit. We ended up making 5 4x6 posts on each side. We probably could have gotten away with doing a 4x4 post, but we decided there wasn't anything wrong with going a little bit overboard, and these were some boards that we were able to get for a great deal, actually. So after we placed the posts upright with the runners on top of them, we placed the arches on top of those to connect the 2 sides. Placing those grooved boards across ties them together and helps to provide just a little bit more stability. We had already placed the plywood inside the grooved board, but if I could do it again, I would wait to do it until later. We had a few posts fall before we had it all put together, and that was a little bit scary. The next step is to place spacers between the arches to keep them from moving. It was a little bit hard to make this frame because the whole time we were very aware of the fact that we would need to take it back apart from the inside. After the spacers are in, it starts to feel just a little bit more solid. We then placed a 2x4 the length of the cellar in the notches we had cut at the top of the arches like a backbone. At this point, we needed 8-foot strips of plywood that were measured exactly for the distance between the plywood arches. These were placed on the little ledges next to the grooves and slid right into place. This keeps the arches in place and helps distribute more of the weight. Then it was time to head to the inside. From underneath, we used scrap to connect the post to the arches and the runners to the spacers. We also used scrap wood to place bracers along the bottom of the posts. With the underside stabilized, we then put some more spacers between the top plywood arches. We put these in a staggered pattern to make them easier to put in and get out later. These aren't only for spacing, but they also provide a space to connect the plywood to when you put it over the top of the arches. We ended up putting the plywood on starting at the center of the backbone, and then we would walk to the end and attach it as it bent with our weight. We had about a 3 to 4 inch strip on each side that still needed to be added, but this kept the center, the more visible area, much cleaner. For a root cellar, it's really important that it has good ventilation. Because of that, we cut a 3-inch hole for a vent on the top towards the front, and then 2 on the back wall. This will allow there to be 1 intake vent and 2 outgoing vents. It's important that we get these put in before the concrete because it really should be poured around it. We then used 6 mil black plastic to cover the top and construction foam to fill in all of the cracks. This is super important because that concrete, it will just drip inside if there are any cracks anywhere. We then gridded number 4 rebar all across the top and connected it to the wall rebar. All of that rebar needed to be 2 to 2.5 inches from the roof all along the arch, so we had to bend it just right. We also placed small bits of cinder blocks under the grid to keep it from sitting too close to the frame. It would be tempting to feel like we were really close to being done at this point, but there's so much to do on the outside still. The first step was to backfill. The top of the cellar was about 4 feet in the air, so instead of building a form that high, we piled the dirt back around it to help hold in the boards of our form. We would need to rebury it eventually anyway, and we wanted a 5-inch roof, so we just reused the 2x6 boards from when we had poured the floor. These long straight boards would only work for the sides though, and we needed to do something that would work with the curve on the front and the back. So that's a little bit trickier. So since the top is arched, the center of the front and back needs to be higher. We just used some plywood scrap and made sure it went higher than we needed. For the front, there was no dirt because of the fact that that's where the stairs are at. So we had to provide some diagonal supports. They looked pretty wonky, but they actually did a good job. Because we wanted a nice clean pour, we decided to order in a batch of concrete. We had them add fiber to increase the strength of our roof. We also decided to have a pump truck come so we didn't have to do buckets of concrete on the top. While it was as expensive as the concrete, my husband thinks it was totally worth it. We allowed the concrete to cure for 2 weeks before removing the forms. Some places say to wait as long as 4 weeks, but this worked well for us. We started with the outside forms. This required a little digging to get to our screws, but it came off without any issues. Now it was time for the nerve-wracking part, removing the inner form. It was kind of funny because the whole time we were taking it apart, we were afraid of it falling on our heads, but it held up there until it was only the plywood left, which eventually came down with a bang. The next two came down really quickly, and I would not have wanted to be in their way. So some caution is definitely warranted. Then it came to taking down that black plastic, and what it revealed was a beautifully shiny, fully intact, perfectly arched ceiling. I was so pleased. We did some touch-up paint and then began to bury the cellar. The next step was to build the walls of our stairwell. We ended up doing it out of the cinder blocks. We thought that this would work really well because we wanted to make sure that it kind of matched the root cellar, but that none of that dirt was going to cave in. So it provided those stable sides for us. And we just did them the same that we had done the walls for the rest of the root cellar. Then my husband installed the doors, and these actually went in pretty nicely as long as you've estimated your sizing right and made sure that you left it just a little bit bigger than the actual door is. Then you can use the shims and get it nice and stable and in good shape there. We considered using a wooden door because I really prefer the aesthetics of that, but when it came down to it, it just seemed like the insulation value of the metal door would work better, and so I just went back later and painted that door so that it looked like it was wood, which ended up working pretty well. To help hold back the dirt from falling into the stairwell, we put in some little flower beds that were around that door area, and we made them kind of tiered and stair-stepping up. This has been a really nice location for me to plant my herbs at. And it provides some little stairs that I can get to the top a little bit easier. I've actually used the top for planting my pumpkins in for the last couple of years. It's kind of nice because you end up with all this greenery and vines and big pumpkins all over it, so it's really pretty. Around the vent that was towards the front, we decided to build a little chimney just for aesthetics because the PVC pipe doesn't look super great, but we thought it would be kind of fun just to make it look like it had a chimney there. Then my husband repurposed some of those 4x6s from when we built the frame on the inside and used those to build our little covered porch area. He did a great job with it, and we found that that nice black hardware made such a difference on how good it looked. Then he covered it with the corrugated metal. It ended up working really, really well. Later on, we'll go ahead and add a pergola, but at this point, really pleased with how it looks. Having used the root cellar for a couple of years now, I have to say I'm really pleased with it. I had had my doubts about the rebar spacing. My husband placed them every other cell in those cinder blocks, and I think I would maybe have gone in every cell. But despite that fact, we haven't had any issues with cracking. Everything looks great inside. The only thing I would change on our entire build is when I did the foundation, I would actually put in French drains, because if we have a heavy snow and then a deep thaw, then I'll get some serious flooding in there, and I have to be really quick with the shop vac. So besides that, it's been great.